A woman holds her son in 1931, but when you look closer at the boy's face, something does not feel right. Dr. Margaret Chen adjusted her reading glasses as she slowly studied the old photograph that had arrived at the Smithsonian archives earlier that day. The black and white picture, dated 1931, captured what looked like a gentle moment. A woman wearing a plain cotton dress was hugging a young boy who appeared to be around 8 years old. They stood in front of what looked like a small farmhouse somewhere in rural Kansas, suggested by the flat land and a wooden fence in the background. "Just another Great Depression family photo," Margaret quietly said to herself, noticing the woman's worn shoes and the boy's patched clothes, clear signs of the hard times people faced back then. The photograph had been donated by the estate of Elanina Hartwell, along with many other family keepsakes from the early 1900s. But as Margaret reached for her magnifying glass to check the photograph's condition for archiving, something stopped her. The woman's face showed real motherly love, her arms wrapped around the child in a protective way. Her expression was gentle and warm, exactly what you would expect from a mother holding her son. The boy, however, was different. Margaret leaned in closer, her breath slowing, while the woman in the photo looked down at the child with clear affection. The boy's eyes seemed to stare straight ahead, with a sharp intensity that felt disturbing for someone so young. His small hands, which should have rested calmly in his mother's arms, looked stiff at his sides. "That's strange," she whispered, moving the desk lamp to get better light on the photo. The longer she studied the boy's face, the more uneasy she felt. There was something in his expression that did not match childhood innocence. Instead, it felt too knowing, too controlled for an 8-year-old child. In her research log, Margaret wrote, "Unusual family photograph. Suggest further research into the Hartwell family history." She could not have known that this single image would uncover a mystery hidden for more than 90 years, changing everything she believed about a mother's love and the secrets families hide in plain sight. 3 days later, Margaret found herself driving along winding roads in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, heading toward the large Victorian house that once belonged to Elanina Hartwell. The elderly woman had died at 97, leaving behind a carefully organized estate and a reputation in the small town of Millfield as someone who lived quietly but with purpose. Eleanor's great-niece, Sarah Morrison, greeted Margaret at the front door. Sarah was in her 40s, with kind eyes and brown hair streaked with gray, pulled back into a simple ponytail. She worked as a librarian in Philadelphia, but had taken time off to manage her great-aunt's affairs. "I'm really glad someone from the Smithsonian is interested in Aunt Eleanor's collection," Sarah said as she guided Margaret through rooms filled with well-preserved furniture and photographs. She cared deeply about family history, though she was always very private about certain parts of our past. The house felt like a step back in time. The wooden floors creaked as they walked past walls covered with family portraits from many generations. Margaret noticed that many of the photographs were professionally mounted and labeled in Elanina's neat handwriting. She never married or had children, Sarah explained, but she dedicated her life to protecting our family's story. She used to say photographs were windows to the soul, showing truths people often want to hide. They entered Elanina's study, a warm room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large oak desk covered with magnifying glasses, photo albums, and handwritten notes. Sarah picked up a leather-bound journal from the desk. "This might interest you," she said, handing it to Margaret. "These are Aunt Elanina's notes about the 1931 photograph you mentioned. She spent years trying to understand it." Margaret opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with dates, thoughts, and unanswered questions written in Elanina's hand. One entry stood out right away, the boy in mother's arms. Why do his eyes hold such darkness? What did he know that we did not? The truth about Thomas must be hidden in these photographs. Thomas. Margaret looked up at Sarah. Who was Thomas? Sarah's face grew uneasy. "That's the problem. We don't really know." Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee from an old percolator in Elanina's kitchen while Margaret laid several photographs across the wooden table. Afternoon sunlight came through lace curtains, casting delicate shadows over the images. "What I'm about to say may sound odd," Sarah began, sitting down. "When I was growing up, I overheard older relatives whisper about a boy named Thomas who lived with my great-grandmother, Ruth Hartwell, in the early 1930s. But the stories never lined up." She pointed to the 1931 photograph that started everything. Some relatives said this was Ruth's son Thomas, who died young from influenza. Others said he wasn't her real son at all, just a child she cared for briefly. A few even claimed Thomas never existed and that the photo showed someone else. Margaret studied the picture again, focusing on the boy's strange expression. What did Elena think? That's what makes this so fascinating, Sarah replied, pulling another photo from a manila envelope. Aunt Elena found this last year while sorting papers in the attic. The second photograph, also from 1931 but taken months later based on clothing, showed Ruth Hartwell standing alone in front of the farmhouse. She looked exhausted, almost haunted, with her hands tightly clasped. There was no sign of the boy. "Turn it over," Sarah said softly. Margaret flipped the photo. In faded ink were the words, "After Thomas left us, may God forgive what we allowed to happen." A chill ran through Margaret. "Left? But your family said he died from influenza." "Exactly," Sarah said quietly. "That's when Aunt Eleanor realized our family had been hiding something for nearly 100 years. She became consumed with finding out who Thomas really was, where he came from, and what truly happened to him." Margaret opened her notebook. "Did Elena find anything else?" Sarah hesitated, then pulled out a third photograph. She found this hidden behind an old mirror in the attic. It's dated 2 weeks before the first photo. This image showed Ruth Hartwell with a different boy, one with lighter hair and a genuine smile. The resemblance between Ruth and this child was clear. "This," Sarah said softly, "was Ruth's real son, James. He died of pneumonia in early 1931, just days after this photo was taken." Margaret returned to Washington, D.C., with copies of all 3 photographs and Elena's notes, her thoughts racing. The next morning, she contacted Dr. James Patterson, a colleague who specialized in photograph, authentication, and historical analysis. "I need you to study these images closely," she said as they met in his Georgetown University lab. "I want to know everything, paper, chemicals, any signs of changes." James, a careful researcher in his mid-50s, placed the first photograph under a powerful digital microscope. "Interesting," he said after a few minutes. "This photo is real. The paper and chemicals match 1931 methods. But something about the image stands out." Margaret leaned closer. "What do you see?" "Look around the boy's face," James said, pointing at the screen. "The grain pattern is slightly different. It's subtle, but it suggests this part of the image went through extra processing." He examined the second photograph of Ruth alone. This one shows no irregularities, very standard for the time. But when he studied the third image of Ruth with James, his tone changed. "Margaret, you need to see this." He overlaid the images on the computer. "Look at the background, the fence, the shadows, the farmhouse position." Margaret stared. The backgrounds were almost identical. "Now look here," James continued, zooming in. "This small tear on Ruth's dress and this scuff on her shoe appear in both images. These photos were taken much closer together than the dates suggest." Margaret's heart pounded. "So you're saying—" "I'm saying they were likely taken on the same day, maybe just hours apart." With this new discovery, Margaret traveled to Millfield, Kansas, where the Hartwells lived in 1931. The small farming town, now home to fewer than 2,000 people, still kept Depression-era records in its town hall. Mary Kowalski, the town clerk, was in her 70s and had lived there her whole life. Her grandfather had been the town doctor in the 1930s. "Ruth Hartwell," Mary said as she pulled out old record books. "Yes, I remember the stories. My grandfather delivered her son James in 1923. Sweet boy, but weak from birth. He died of pneumonia in February 1931. It broke Ruth's heart." Margaret showed her the photographs. Mary studied them closely. "This is definitely Ruth," she said. "And this boy here, James, he looks just like the Hartwells. But when she saw the photo of Ruth with the dark-haired boy, her face changed. I don't recognize this child at all, and I knew every family here back then." She paused. "There's something unsettling about his eyes. He looks much older than he should." Mary checked the 1931 records. James Hartwell died on February 15, 1931, but there's no record of any other child living with Ruth that year. No adoption, no guardianship. She looked at Margaret. "Officially, Ruth lived alone after James died until she moved to Pennsylvania later that year. Margaret shivered. Is there anyone else who might remember? Mary nodded. Frank Morrison. He's 94 and lives at the Assisted Living Center. His family farmed next to the Hartwells. At the Millfield Assisted Living Center, Frank Morrison sat by a window, his mind sharp despite his age. When he saw the photograph of Ruth with the dark-haired boy, his hands shook. Dear God, he whispered. I never thought I'd see that face again. You remember him? Margaret asked. Frank nodded. Thomas. That's what Ruth called him, though I don't think that was his real name. He showed up a week or two after James died. Ruth was lost in grief, and then suddenly, there was this boy. Where did he come from? No one knew, Frank said. Ruth said she was helping him for a while. But there was something very wrong with that child. Frank explained that Thomas rarely spoke, but when he did, his words sounded far too mature. He knew things he shouldn't have known, private details about neighbors and events from before he arrived. Even the animals avoided him, Frank added. Our dog would hide, and Ruth's cow would get restless whenever he came near. Animals can sense things, you know, Margaret said, as she showed Frank the photograph of Ruth standing by herself. What happened to Thomas? Frank's face darkened. He vanished one night in late summer of 1931. Ruth never talked about it, but the next morning she was not the same. She seemed relieved, yet troubled at the same time. Within a few months she moved away and never came back to Millfield. Was he ever reported missing? That was the strangest part, Frank said. No one appeared to care that he was gone. It was almost as if the whole town agreed to erase him from memory. Even Ruth behaved as though he had never existed. Frank leaned closer, lowering his voice. But there's something I've never told anyone else. 3 days after Thomas vanished, I walked past Ruth's farm and saw her digging in the backyard. She was digging deep behind the barn, working all night by lantern light. Margaret contacted Sarah Morrison right after speaking with Frank. Together they drove to Kansas to find the original Hartwell farm. It had been abandoned since the 1950s but was still standing on farmland, now owned by a local agricultural company. The current owner, Robert Jensen, was a practical man in his 60s who had grown up hearing stories about the cursed Hartwell place. He quickly gave them permission to explore and even offered the ground-penetrating radar he used to check irrigation lines. The farmhouse was falling apart. The roof had collapsed long ago, and years of weather had stripped much of the wood siding away. Still, the stone foundation was solid, and the old barn Frank mentioned was still there, though its red paint had faded to a dull brown. Margaret and Sarah spent the morning walking the land, comparing old photos to the present view. Even after decades of neglect, they found the exact spot where Ruth had once stood with both boys. It was a small rise in the ground with a clear view of the house. Frank said Ruth was digging behind the barn, Margaret reminded Sarah, as they walked toward the worn structure. The area behind it was thick with tall grass and weeds, but the radar would be able to find any disturbed soil. Robert Jensen arrived around noon with the equipment. The radar looked like a large lawnmower with a screen that showed what lay underground. As he slowly pushed it across the ground behind the barn, Margaret and Sarah watched closely. There, Robert said suddenly, stopping the machine. Something is definitely buried here, about 4 feet down and roughly rectangular. Margaret felt her heart speed up. How big? Robert studied the screen, about the size of a large suitcase or, he hesitated, looking uneasy, possibly a small coffin. Sarah grabbed Margaret's arm. You don't think? There's only one way to know, Margaret said firmly. We need to call the sheriff. If there's even a chance human remains are here, this must be handled the right way. As they waited for authorities, Margaret could not shake the feeling that they were close to uncovering a truth the Hartwell family, and maybe all of Millfield, had tried to bury for 90 years. The wind moved across the empty farm, whistling through broken windows and stirring the tall grass. In that sound, Margaret almost thought she heard a child's voice. Not playful laughter, but something far more disturbing. Sheriff David Martinez arrived within an hour, along with the county coroner and a forensic team from state police. Martinez had seen many strange cases, but investigating a possible crime scene from 90 years ago was something new even for him. We need to be extremely careful, said Dr. Linda Chen, the forensic anthropologist, as her team prepared. If there are remains, they will be very fragile. And if this connects to a crime, any evidence must be preserved. Digging began slowly. Once they reached the depth shown by the radar, the team removed soil by hand. Margaret and Sarah watched from a distance, tense but fascinated by the careful work. After 2 hours, a technician called out, "I've found something." Dr. Chen knelt and gently brushed dirt away from the corner of what looked like wood. As more soil was cleared, a small handmade wooden box appeared, about the size of a child's coffin, clearly built by someone unskilled. "This wasn't made by a professional," Dr. Chen said, pointing out the rough joints. "Someone built it quickly, likely under great stress." Sheriff Martinez photographed everything as the box was lifted from the ground. A simple latch held it closed, worn but still intact. "Before we open this," the sheriff said, "everyone needs to understand how serious this is. If these are human remains, this could be evidence of a crime from 1931. Everything must follow proper procedure." Dr. Chen carefully opened the latch. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had once been white but was now brown with age, were the clear remains of a small human skeleton. As she gently moved the cloth aside, her focused expression shifted to confusion. "This is strange," she said quietly. "These bones show unusual development. The skull suggests someone much older than the size would indicate, possibly an adult with severe abnormalities." Or, she paused, examining the bones more closely. "Or what?" Martinez asked. "I've never seen anything like this," she replied. "The bone structure suggests someone far older than their body size. And look here." She pointed to the skull. Even Margaret and Sarah could see the teeth were wrong for a child. They were adult teeth in a much smaller skull. While the forensic team continued their work, Margaret received a call from James Patterson at Georgetown University. His research into the photographs had led to an important discovery. "Margaret," he said, "I've been looking into historical medical conditions that could explain what you found. Based on your description, this may be a case of progeria or a similar disorder." Margaret was unfamiliar with it, and James explained that progeria is a very rare genetic condition that causes rapid aging in children, making them appear elderly while still young. In 1931, almost nothing was known about it. "But here's the key part," James added. "I found records from 1930 about a boy named Timothy Walsh who disappeared from a state facility in Nebraska. He had an advanced form of progeria and severe behavioral issues." Margaret felt everything begin to connect. "What kind of issues?" she asked. "The records say Timothy had the mind and emotions of an adult trapped in a failing child's body. His appearance and behavior deeply disturbed people. He was described as manipulative and highly aware, able to understand adult emotions in ways people at the time found frightening." The meaning was clear. What Ruth Hartwell experienced was not something supernatural, but a tragic encounter with a child suffering from a rare illness no one understood. "James, can you send me those records?" Margaret asked. "I think Timothy Walsh and Thomas are the same person." After the call, Margaret shared everything with Sarah. Suddenly their findings made sense. Ruth hadn't faced anything unnatural, but a very sick child who seemed strange to people in 1931. "So Timothy died while staying with Ruth?" Sarah asked. "That seems likely," Margaret said. "Ruth probably cared for him out of kindness, but when he died, she panicked. People didn't understand progeria then. Authorities might have accused her of harming him, or worse." She paused, looking toward the dig site. She buried him in secret to protect herself, but also to give him a respectful burial he never would have received. 3 weeks later, Margaret and Sarah stood in Elanina Hartwell's study, having spent days putting together the full story through records, town files, and Elanina's careful notes. What began as a strange photograph had uncovered a deeply human story of kindness, loss, and fear. The forensic results confirmed their theory. The remains were of a child about 10 years old, but with bones and teeth of someone far older. DNA testing, limited by time, strongly suggested Thomas was Timothy Walsh. "Eleanor suspected the truth," Sarah said, reading from her great-aunt's notes. "Ruth saved that poor boy from a life of suffering. When he died, she gave him the burial he deserved, even at great risk to herself." Margaret arranged for Timothy Walsh to be reburied in the Millfield Cemetery with a proper headstone. The inscription, approved by both families, read, "Timothy Walsh, 1920 to 1931, a child who knew too much suffering, now at peace. The 1931 photograph finally made sense. Ruth's care was real. She had been protecting a very sick child with nowhere else to go. Timothy's unsettling expression was not evil, but the pain and confusion of a child aging far too fast, with a mind too old for his body. Ruth was a hero, Margaret thought as she studied the photo one last time. When others would have been afraid, Ruth saw a child in need. She gave him comfort in life and dignity in death. The story showed the power of compassion and how fear of the unknown can force good people into silence. Ruth Hartwell carried her secret for decades. Margaret placed the photograph into an archival sleeve. It would be donated to the Smithsonian, now displayed with the full story, not as a mystery, but as proof of human kindness. The boy's face no longer seemed disturbing. Margaret saw what Ruth had seen all along, a child who needed love and to be remembered, not for how he looked, but for the compassion he awakened in others. In the end, the photograph revealed its truth. Sometimes what feels wrong is simply something we do not yet understand. In the quiet months that followed, the story continued to live on in small, meaningful ways that could not be measured by reports or records, because the truth they uncovered slowly changed how people thought about the past, about fear, and about kindness. And Margaret often reflected on how close the truth had come to being lost forever, buried not just in the ground but under silence, shame, and misunderstanding. And she realized that history is full of moments where compassion survives quietly while fear speaks loudly, and Ruth Hartwell's life became a powerful example of how one ordinary person can carry an extraordinary burden alone, choosing mercy when the world offers no guidance, because in 1931 there were no words, no explanations, and no protection for a woman caring for a child who seemed wrong in ways people could not explain. And Ruth had lived in a time when being different was dangerous and when knowledge moved slowly. Yet she still chose to care, to protect, and to give dignity when none was expected. And Margaret thought often about how Timothy must have felt, trapped in a body that did not match his mind, surrounded by adults who feared him, and how Ruth may have been the first person to look at him without horror, to see not a monster or a mystery, but a suffering child who needed warmth, food, and safety. And this understanding reshaped how Margaret viewed the photograph, because what once felt disturbing now felt deeply sad and even gentle, and she began to notice details she had overlooked before, like the way Ruth stood close enough to protect without touching, and how Timothy's eyes, while intense, also carried exhaustion and loneliness. And she realized that history often judges people by what they hide instead of why they hide it. And Ruth had hidden the truth not because she was cruel or guilty, but because she lived in a world that would not have understood her kindness. And as Margaret spoke about the case at lectures and conferences, she avoided dramatic language and instead spoke plainly, because this was not a story about mystery or horror, but about misunderstanding. And she told students that science without compassion can become cold, while compassion without knowledge can become dangerous. And Ruth had lived at the intersection of both, doing the best she could with what she had. And slowly the story spread beyond academic circles, reaching people who saw themselves in Ruth's fear and courage, parents who understood how love sometimes requires silence, and caretakers who knew how easy it is for society to judge what it does not understand. And letters began to arrive, some from families who had hidden relatives with rare conditions, others from people who felt seen by the story, and Margaret kept every letter, understanding that Timothy's life, though short and painful, was now creating connection and empathy decades later. And she thought about how different things might have been if Timothy had been born later, with doctors who could explain his condition, laws that could protect him, and communities that could support Ruth. And yet she also knew that progress does not erase the past, it only helps us understand it better. And when Margaret visited the Millfield Cemetery, she noticed that people had begun leaving small stones and flowers near Timothy's headstone, quiet signs of remembrance from strangers who felt moved by a child they never knew. And this simple act felt important, because it showed that even forgotten lives can be honored once the truth is known. And Sarah once said that the most painful part of the story was not Timothy's illness, but the fact that people had been so afraid of what they did not understand. And Margaret agreed, because fear had isolated Ruth, erased Thomas from town memory, and forced a grieving woman to carry a secret for the rest of her life. And as Margaret continued her work, she became more careful with how she approached unexplained stories, reminding herself that behind every mystery there is a human being, often frightened, often alone, doing their best, and she hoped that future historians would remember this case not as a strange footnote, but as a lesson about empathy. And she imagined Ruth in her final years, perhaps believing the truth would never be known, never forgiven, and she wished she could tell her that her actions would one day be understood, that her quiet courage would be recognized, and that Timothy would finally be remembered by his real name, not as a shadow or a rumor, but as a child who lived, suffered, and was loved. And this thought stayed with Margaret, reminding her that understanding does not always come quickly, but when it does, it has the power to transform fear into compassion, silence into truth, and forgotten stories into shared human memory.